Hey, it's a little overcast here today in Niagara Falls. I got myself a fresh haircut, so I think I look pretty good. But the weather's not looking all that good today at all for riding. So I've been meaning to change the brake pads on my DR, and I finally got the parts in. I got fresh pads and fresh fluid, and Carl's coming over a little bit later to actually help put those parts on. So before it starts raining on my head, let's get in the shop and see if we can't get this girl some new brake shoes. Changing the brake fluid in your brake system is probably one of the most important maintenance routines a motorcycle rider can perform. And it's also, unfortunately, one of the most overlooked. Now, in my video on how to buy a DR650, I talked about this and the importance of clean, fresh brake fluid. Now, today we'll take a deeper dive together into this interesting topic. Now, the system is deceptively simple and complex all at the same time. Small valves and orifices inside of your master cylinder and your caliper must be kept clean and lubricated. And this is often overlooked by most owners, leading to brake issues further down the line. Now, the number one way to ensure safe performance and long service life for your brakes is to change out the fluid as per your manufacturer's recommendations. Now, this is usually done every 2 years or so, but why, you say? Why? What goes wrong with brake fluid? Well, most brake fluids absorb water from the air, meaning that they're hygroscopic. Now, this water contaminates and compromises the fluid performance by decreasing its boiling point, which leads to brake fade and corrosion of your internal parts. Now, in fact, DOT3 and DOT4, which are glycol-based brake fluids, can absorb as much as 2% of their weight in water each year. Now, this absorption happens through the opening of the master cylinder, through seals, and even through the rubber brake lines themselves, meaning that no matter what you do, water's going to find its way in. If you're unsure what the service intervals are or what type of fluid that your bike requires, well, your owner's manual is a good place to start, or a good shop manual, which I always say you should have. And even the top of the master cylinder usually tells you what type of fluid you take in your ride. So take a look at that before you go to the supply store to buy what you need. Now, all brake fluids undergo testing by the Department of Transportation, and these tests are both performed for what they call a dry fluid, which is a brake fluid with no water in it at all. It's basically fresh right out of the container. But they also test what they call a wet fluid, and that contains 3.7% of water. Now, this water is added to the brake fluid to simulate 2 seasons of use. This chart here shows you the difference in boiling point for the most common fluids. And when the fluid boils, let's just say that your best day ever ride with your buddies on that mountain road or mountain trail, well, it just got really interesting. Now, as I mentioned, DOT3 and DOT4 are both glycol-based fluids, and they're both compatible in a pinch. Now, although if your bike calls for DOT4 fluid, use DOT4 fluid if you can. It has a higher boiling point than DOT3, and it's considered to be a more advanced fluid than DOT3 is as a whole. DOT5 is actually a silicone-based brake fluid, so it is not hygroscopic, and it's often used in old classic cars where they sit for long periods of time and they don't want water to start to build up in the brake system. The problem is it is not compatible at all with DOT3 or DOT fluids, and even traces of glycol fluids in DOT5 fluid can cause a gelling effect which leads to poor performance or even worse, brake failure. So if you're going to convert to a DOT5 fluid, a very thorough flushing is required. And given that you're now limited in the type of fluid that you can use if you need to make a field repair, I would caution against it unless you're really, really diehard on doing so. Now, to make things even more confusing for the consumer, there is a DOT 5.1 fluid. And this fluid is actually glycol based. It is not compatible with DOT 5, but it is compatible with DOT 3 and DOT 4. And it has an extremely high boiling point. But don't ever make the mistake of mixing DOT 5 with DOT 5.1, as these are just not compatible at all. Okay, that's the chemistry lesson for today. There's not going to be a test. So let's get to the fun stuff and start changing the fluids out on this DR650's brakes. I thought the easiest thing to do, or one of the best things to do, is to put a brake system right up here on the bench for you to see. Now, the brake systems, this one's off of a snowmobile. That's why the brake lever is actually on the left-hand side, not the right-hand side, but they all work similar. And a brake system is composed of 4 components that we're going to walk through. Now, the first component is this lever assembly here. So it's composed of a brake lever that applies leverage to the master cylinder, which sits underneath here. And it also has a reservoir on top that holds a small amount of brake fluid. Now, when you apply pressure or leverage to this lever, it pushes a piston through the master cylinder, picks up a little bit of fluid, and drives it through a valve here into these brake lines. So these brake lines here, well, they're a special hose, or a high pressure hose that's designed not to expand when pressure is applied to them. It's not like a garden hose. And fluid pressure travels down this line to the third component, which is your brake caliper. Now, this is where your brake pads are housed. This one doesn't have any brake pads in it because I want to show you how the caliper actually works. But they sit down inside this slot and they float in there. Now, brake calipers have a cylinder bore here, and inside that cylinder bore is a piston. In this case, there's 2 opposing pistons. On the DR, the 2 pistons on the front are here, and some only have a single piston. But as you squeeze the brake lever, take a look right here, and you're going to see, hopefully, that the brake piston comes out. You can see it coming out right there. And it retracts a little bit every time you let go of the lever. So it goes out, and then it settles back a little bit so your brakes don't drag on the rotor. Now, the rotor is the 4th piece of hardware in the brake system. And you have one attached to the front and one attached to the back wheel. And they fit right up inside the caliper. And as you apply pressure, the brake pads clamp down on that rotor and in turn stop your motorcycle. So today what we're going to do is we're going to flush the fluid out through the brake reservoirs to make sure we have fresh, clean fluid. And we're going to put brand new brake pads in the DR as well. We're going to check them, the old ones, just to see what the wear limit's like, but for this example, we're going to use new pads altogether. So I hope that helps explain a little bit how a brake system works. It's a very high-level overview, but it's kind of neat to see it on the bench like this. To bleed the brake lines, you really can do it one of 2 ways. You can do it the manual method, which is how most people are going to do it. And that usually is easier if you have 2 people. So Carl's going to come over today and give me a hand to do that. Now, to do it, you basically only need a few tools. You need a good quality screwdriver to get your master cylinder cap off on the front. You need an 8mm wrench to open and close your bleed valves. You need a little bit of fuel line to attach to your brake bleeder screw. Now, This isn't 100% necessary. Some people just let it bleed out all over the place, but for me, I always use a hose, and then I will use a disposable plastic bottle with a hole drilled in the cap that I can press the, I try to get it tight like this, but you can press the hose in like this. Now I'm going to rinse this bottle out, but what this does is it gives you a spot to capture the old brake fluid in. Now that's the manual method. We'll go over that in a little more detail, but we're also going to use an auto bleed kit that I've had for a while. So these things are kind of neat. They're basically a vacuum pump that you hook up onto your brake bleeder screw, and it pulls the fluid through the master cylinder into this cup here. And one person can do the whole job with this kit. Now these aren't terribly expensive. I think this was maybe $35. And they come with an assortment of fittings and different tubes and whatnot to fit just about any type of brake bleed system. And in fact, even with a T like this, you can bleed 2 calipers at once if you're doing the front of your car or something like that, or if you have dual brakes on your bike. So I'll show you how to use that system as well today, and I'll include a link down below to where you can buy this, because I just bought this off Amazon. To protect any painted or plastic surfaces, I always put a little rag underneath the front reservoir before I open up the cap. Now, when you do get to that front reservoir, make sure to use a nice sharp screwdriver. I've seen a lot of these small screws over the years where they've been stripped out, and they're really difficult to both get out and then retighten. So take your time, just use a nice good screwdriver, and make sure to set those bolts somewhere where you won't lose them. Now this cap, when it does come off, has a bladder underneath it. So does the rear reservoir, and this holds the fluid down in the reservoir and allows it for atmospheric changes. And you can really see how dark brown this fluid is. It was really time to change it. So I'm going to start by popping off the dust cap off the bleeder screw here. I'm going to snap an 8mm box end on there and wiggle this hose on here. Sometimes they're a little hard, but eventually you'll get it, and that's attached to our bleed screw. So I'm just going to open that screw up, and Carl's just going to pump the brakes a little bit to force all the old fluid out, and we'll add fluid as we need it to force it through until it runs clear. Once that's the case, we just tighten that bleed screw up, and we add some fresh fluid to the reservoir. And look at how nice and clear this DOT4 fluid is. That's the way it really should look. So we just top up the reservoir, and then Carl slowly squeezes the lever this time and holds it to the bar. I will open the bleed screw and then close it again, and this lets all the air out of the system. He slowly releases it and then slowly squeezes it again, and I continue the process. Open the bleeder screw, close the bleeder screw once all the air flows through, and we keep going until all the air is out. We top this up with fresh fluid, and then we'll put the cap back on. You can see here, now be careful it doesn't overflow. You don't want to overflow these at all. Put those screws back in and snug them down. Again, this doesn't have to be like Hercules here. Just snug them so the O-ring seals. And then take a little bit of brake cleaner and clean all the components just in case you got any kind of splash. It's pretty easy and the job's done. Alright, so this is our brake bleeder assembly here, and the way this works is you have a capture cup with an O-ring that we're going to put a little bit of fluid in there and then cap it, so this will become a sealed vessel. Now the vacuum pump itself gets connected on the other side over here, and this in turn goes to your brake screw. So the way this works is you just put fluid in the reservoir and pump the brakes, and it will suck it down through until it runs clear. So the nice thing about this is Carl can keep filling up the reservoir while I pump the brakes, and we should be able to get the back brake working really well. Unlike the front brakes, the rear brake uses this remote master cylinder that's actuated by the foot pedal. You can see me moving it here. Now, it works the same way. The only difference is it has this low pressure remote reservoir that sits underneath the tank. Now, whether you have a safari tank like myself or a regular tank, you're probably going to want to take this reservoir out to make it easier to add fluid. Now it's easy enough. Use a 10mm nut driver and pull it out, and you're gonna see a retaining clip that holds the cap in place so it doesn't vibrate off when you're going down the road. After you get that out, just swing the reservoir out and you have access. Now I'm going to take the dust cap off the rear screw and tuck in a little bit of a rag here just to stop any drips. And I was lucky enough, Carl stuck around here to give me a hand. And yes, I realize I don't have gloves here. I just grabbed the reservoir to give him a little bit of a hand while he took the cap off. And he also takes out the bladder that sits underneath the cap here. You'll see it in a second. Now he's just going to add a little bit of fluid just to make sure we have enough to flush the system. And he's going to actuate the brake pump while I work the bleed screw. So he's going to pressurize the system here. And then I'm just going to open up the bleed screw and watch what happens. It just pulls that fluid right through. He's going to keep an eye on it to make sure it doesn't run dry. And once we pull enough fluid through, I'm simply going to close the screw and pull off the hose. And watch this. Boop! It sucks everything into that cup. Not a drop gets anywhere. Now it's just a matter of reattaching the remote reservoir and that safety clip. Don't forget it. And the job's just about done. It's pretty easy. It took about 10 minutes. And anybody can really do this. It looks really good. Now, if I know I'm going to change out the brake pads and the brake fluid, I'm always going to do the fluid first so that I don't contaminate the new brake materials. Now, to get the pads out, you do not have to take the caliper off the bike. You just remove these two pins that have cap head screws in them. I'm going to fit an Allen head socket in by hand to make sure that it's in right, and I'll tap it if I have to with a hammer. After that, I'll attach the ratchet and break free the pin. Now these pins ride all the way across to the other side of the caliper, and they basically locate those pads inside of the caliper so they slide cleanly. I'll basically wiggle them out of here, and you can see this one's completely corroded. It needs a good cleaning. And then I'll wiggle the second one out, and you'll see that they're both exactly the same. You don't have to worry about mixing them up. The next thing we're going to do is just gently compress the piston back in, and you can actually see the caliper move. This gives you access to slide out the rear brake, and you can see there's still lots of material left on these. You could probably reuse them, but I'm going to throw a new set in anyway. Then we slide the brake caliper over, and out comes the one here. You just have to twist it a little bit and it'll come out. So you sort of tip it like that and it'll come out in and around the caliper. Now there should be a spring up in there. If the spring does fall out, you may have to loosen this bolt, tip the caliper back and reposition the spring, but this one looks good. Now the front brake is very, very similar to the back, except it only has one retaining pin, and it's actually held underneath this cap here. So you need to get a good screwdriver and get that cap out. Once that protective cap comes out, you can insert your socket like that. Then you just hook up your socket or your ratchet, and it's the same deal. I'm going to keep this one separated just in case it's a different piece. So we'll push the caliper in and see if we can't get these pads out as well. Let's have a look and see here. There's the first one. And there comes the second one. Now that we have the brake pads out, I want to have a little bit closer look at all the components and see what we're going to do next. So here are your brake pins. I'm going to clean these up at the wire wheel. So what I'll do is I'll just take a Allen key and I'll insert it, and then I can turn these on the wire wheel and clean all that up. Now I think you could probably do that quite easily with Scotch-Brite as well, but you don't want anything that's going to pit or erode away the metal on these pins. The pad itself basically slides along these pins like this. Okay, so you can see if it's a little rough or whatever, it's not going to slide very easily. And you can see here, this is how they work, right? Now the other thing is, these rear brake pads have some covers on them here that we'll have to transfer over onto the new pads. So I'll clean these up with a little bit of brake cleaner and Scotch-Brite just to clean them up. And they even have a second piece of material underneath the cover. So let me just pry these off. You can see that there's actually a second piece of material here that's attached to these backer plates. So I'll move the whole works over onto the new pad. Now if you have a look here, you can really see that there's still a lot of material left on here. There's well over 1 millimeter of friction material. So like I say, I could reuse these, and I am confident these are EBC brakes. The front ones definitely are, they say right on them. And like I said, it's nice to buy high quality brake components. These EBC brake pads are made in the United States, and I bought the R types here, which means they're really good for mud and wet weather. So for an adventure rider, the R-type pad is probably a very good choice. Okay, I'm going to clean all these parts up and then we'll start reassembly. Okay, so we're going to install the front brake pads here. But one thing that you need to realize is these are a semicircle, so they only go in one way. So the way that I sort of determine how these go in is I put them back to back like this, the way that they would go into the caliper. And then I line them up so that this radius is facing inwards. So this is how they actually go in. If you put them in the other way, they're not going to fit right, and you're going to have a lot of problems. So again, that radius right there, that faces into your hub this way. So let's see if I can slide these in without too much problems. Now I'm going to install the front facing pad first, so the one that's on the outside of the caliper here. And it should just slide up and right in like that. Now there is a spring inside that holds these from rattling, and that can be a little bit challenging to get in a little ways here to hold that first brake pad. Oh man. Okay, so it's going to go up into the caliper. There we go. And then you sort of pull the brake pad back as you push the pin through. You'll be able to see it a little easier once you get your head underneath there. So I'm just going to go like that, and I'm going to put back in our protective cap here. That just gets threaded in. The rear pads are a little bit different. They're not as round as the front ones. You can see they're pretty much a rectangle. So you can sort of see this circle here fits with that. So I'm just going to put it back the same way. And I'm going to put the first pad in just like this. So it should just slide in. And I'm going to hold it in place. Let's see here. Should be able to squeeze this up. So you're gonna see that I should be able to get in there, baby. There we go. They should go in, and then that will fit right in like that. There we go. There we go. So these are now captured. You can see that pin can now be threaded right back in. See how they float? Everything floats. Looks good. So that really wraps up how you change both your brake pads and your fluid on your DR650's brake system. Now it's recommended to do this every 2 years, and I would highly recommend it, even though the fluid may not look like it needs it. Now again, if you are unsure or unconfident in doing this process, take it to a professional. This can be a little bit tricky, especially when you get to the bleeding process, and it can be a little bit frustrating even for people that have done it a number of times. These small brake calipers can be really finicky sometimes. Now, once you're sure that the brakes work well, you've tested them 2 or 3 times, there's no leaks, everything's dry, and the brakes are stopping you, you want to take them out and give them a little bit of a break-in period. Now, this probably isn't necessary, but it's something I like to do. I'll take it out onto a sort of secluded back road. I'll run the bike up to, about 50 kilometers an hour. I think that's about 35 miles an hour for our American friends. And then I'll apply about 50% brake power and bring the bike down almost to a stop. Then I'll release the brakes and re-accelerate up to that 50 kilometers an hour. I'll do this a few times just to sort of seat the pads into the rotors and make sure there's a good fit. And I may even bring it out onto a sort of a back road that's a little faster and run it up to, say, 80 kilometers an hour or 50 miles an hour and do the same process a couple times as well. And I like to do this before I have to rely on the brakes for an emergency stop or some kind of a maneuver off-road where you need your full maximum brake capacity. So again, I really appreciate you stopping by here at the Tinker Shed and sort of hanging out with myself and Carl, and I hope that you've learned a few things. Please take the time to comment if you have something you want to say or you have a question that I can help answer. Again, I'm not a mechanic, but I do know a lot of people, and maybe I can get the answer for you. So until then, you take care, and I'll see you soon on Dino's Tinker Shed.